That evening I was in the kitchen setting the table. The scent of fried chicken breasts and freshly cooked potatoes filled the air, while the sounds of light chatter filled the space. It was a typical evening at our house. Tom and I had been married for several years, and I thought I knew everything about our cozy, predictable rhythm. But then he showed up. Jake. Tom's friend. The one I always considered just that. A friend. I had no idea that his presence would shift the atmosphere so drastically. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I accidentally met his eyes, something in my chest tightened. It was strange. He looked as though he had no idea what he was doing. Suddenly, everything about our usual life felt alien for a moment. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered. As he laughed and shared jokes with Tom, I found myself stealing glances at him, confused and unsettled. He was younger than Tom and me, always upbeat, always full of energy, but there was something else too, a magnetic confidence. It felt like he wasn't just part of the conversation anymore, he was part of something bigger, something unspoken, and I couldn't ignore it. I continued to go about my evening, setting the plates, bringing out the food, but every time I looked up, I found myself meeting his eyes again, and every time, that strange feeling returned. It was as if something was quietly shifting between us, without words. I couldn't figure it out, but it was there, in the space between us. And I couldn't shake the sense that my life, our life, was on the brink of something I hadn't expected. I tried to avoid looking at him, but I could feel his eyes following every move I made. Jake was the life of the party, effortlessly charming. A few years younger than both Tom and me, exuding a carefree confidence that seemed to pull everyone in. He wasn't the kind of person I could flirt with, not that I ever would, but the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, everything about him seemed to pull me in, despite my best efforts to resist. It wasn't like I was attracted to him in any obvious way. I didn't have a crush, I wasn't looking for anything else, but there was something about him that unsettled me. It wasn't just the way he smiled or laughed. It was something deeper, a kind of energy that wrapped around me, one I didn't know how to interpret. I caught his gaze again across the room, and for a brief second, the world seemed to pause. His eyes didn't look away. I had to look away first. My heart raced in a way it shouldn't have, a flutter I couldn't explain. Tom was busy talking to someone else, unaware of the subtle shift that was happening right in front of him. And yet, the tension between Jake and me was so palpable, it felt like it was almost visible. My skin seemed to prickle with an electric charge every time he came near. I told myself to ignore it, to keep things normal, to stay focused on Tom, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to pull me back in. It was silly. I had to be imagining things. Jake was just Tom's friend. That was it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The air was thick with something unsaid, something that felt as inevitable as it was dangerous. I needed a moment to breathe. The kitchen had become too crowded, too warm. I stepped out onto the balcony, holding a glass of wine in my hand, feeling the cool night air wash over me, calming the tightness in my chest. I told myself I was just tired, just overwhelmed by the noise and the energy. I had to remind myself of who I was, a wife. Someone grounded in a life I'd built with Tom. But then I felt it, that presence. Jake was standing beside me, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the kitchen behind him. I hadn't heard him come out. It was like he had just materialized there without making a sound. "You look a little off," he said with a smile, his voice warm and low, teasing in a way that felt too familiar. I forced a smile, trying to play it off. "I'm just tired," I said, taking a sip of my wine, the glass cold against my fingers. But he wasn't convinced. His eyes studied me too sharply, like he was seeing right through the words I had just spoken. "You're not tired," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's something else." I laughed lightly, hoping to brush it off. "I don't know what you mean." Jake didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, analyzing. "It's like you're somewhere else," he said, his tone serious now. Like there's something you're holding back. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to laugh it off again. But I couldn't. His words felt too close to the truth. There was something I was holding back. Something I didn't understand, but that felt so strong and undeniable now. I tried to pull myself together, to regain control of the conversation, but it was like trying to hold on to water slipping through my fingers. He took a step closer, and the space between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. I could feel the heat of his presence, his gaze still fixed on me. It was as if he was daring me to admit something I wasn't ready to face. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. But he wasn't buying it. He didn't need me to say anything more. His eyes told me he already knew. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was no going back. The connection between us had already been made, and it was impossible to deny it any longer. A few days passed, but the tension remained. It lingered in the spaces between words, in the silences that stretched too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the balcony, his words, the way they pierced right through me. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a fluke, that I could push it all aside. But Jake's presence kept creeping into my thoughts, and the more I tried to avoid him, the more my mind seemed to draw me back. It wasn't until he showed up at the house again that I knew there was no escaping it. He came by to help with the car, he said. I knew better. There was always something more behind his visits, something unspoken that neither of us could ignore. The house was quiet when he arrived, and Tom was busy in the other room. Jake moved through the space with an easy, familiar confidence, and I couldn't help but notice how he seemed so at ease in my home. He was fixing something under the hood of the car, and I stood by the kitchen window, watching him through the glass. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way his hands worked with such precision. I should have gone back inside, kept busy, but my feet wouldn't move. My body felt anchored to that spot, drawn to him in a way I didn't understand. He caught my gaze, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, heavy, as though it was charged with an electric current. He didn't break the silence. He just watched me. And in that moment, I couldn't look away. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, stepping toward the door. "Everything's good," he said casually, but his voice was different now, quieter, like he knew that something had shifted between us. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. "Thanks for helping." Jake stood in the doorway, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine as he passed. The touch was so light, so subtle, but it felt like a jolt of electricity running through my body. I froze, my heart racing. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. He'd felt it too. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, and just like that, the line had been crossed. Neither of us said anything. There didn't need to be words. We both knew that what had just happened couldn't be undone. I stood there in the kitchen, my breath shallow, and I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears. Everything around me felt distant, like the world had blurred into the background. The only thing I could focus on was the pull between us, undeniable, relentless. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, but deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to go back to my normal life, to pretend like nothing had changed. I went through the motions, cooking dinner, talking to Tom, making small talk with friends, even laughing at the right moments. But no matter how hard I tried to settle back into my routine, there was a constant undercurrent I couldn't escape. It was in the way I looked at Tom, how everything felt slightly off, as if the world was being viewed through a foggy window. Jake's presence lingered. Every time I was with Tom, I could feel it, an unspoken weight in the air. It wasn't just that I couldn't stop thinking about him, it was the way everything seemed to have changed. Even the simplest moments felt tainted. I caught myself staring off into space, wondering what Jake was doing, or remembering the way his hand brushed mine so lightly, but with a force that left me shaken. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of weakness. But I knew it was more than that. I avoided Jake for a while. When I saw his name on my phone, I'd ignore his messages. When he came by to visit Tom, I found excuses to stay out of the house. But it only made things worse. The more I distanced myself, the stronger the pull became. It was as if I were trying to run away from something that was chasing me.